All right, let's talk about A Raisin in the Sun. It's a play by Lorraine Hansberry about a black family living in the south side of Chicago. And we'll talk about kind of what more it's about in just a minute. But let's first talk about the kind of historical context for when the play was written and performed. It was first published in 1959. So thinking back on your history, what else is going on then? Well, the civil rights movement was going on then. So it was kind of a big deal, as a bit of a helper, not that it necessarily changed the world or anything, but it was certainly along the same themes of the civil rights movement. It was the first Broadway production by an African American woman, and so that made it kind of groundbreaking. That kind of opened up some doors for those to follow. Some more historical context. There's kind of mention of this very, very briefly, but the Great Migration. That was the movement of millions of Southern African Americans to cities in the North seeking relief from racism and poverty. So you can imagine, once the slaves were freed in the 1860s, okay, slaves are free. That doesn't mean that racism ended, especially in the South. There was the rise of the KKK all across the nation, but I think there was a heavy concentration of persecution and lynchings in the South. So you can imagine why a lot of black people in the United States, in the South in particular, would want to move away from that particular area. So they're thinking, oh man, the South was kind of like, that's like the super racist part of America, right? So let's get out of that. So the Great Migration is a movement of a lot of black people from the South to other areas of the United States, in particular the North and the West. The irony, as you can see on the screen, is they didn't find that things were much different. Racism is widespread, and just because the North was, for the abolition of slavery, doesn't necessarily mean that there weren't a lot of racists in the North as well. So unfortunately, they didn't find, a lot of the relief that they were looking for. In 1890, 85% of African Americans were in the South. In 1960, only 42% were in the South. So you can see between that time period, I know that's a long time period, but between that time period, there was a great movement out of the South. Okay. For the most part, this group of people were searching for the American dream. The American dream is a little tricky. What is the American dream? The American dream is the idea that if I work really hard, I can find financial success and I can find general success in life. So it's based on how hard I work. Unfortunately, many people found that the American dream, especially black people, found that the American dream was a lie. That it didn't matter how hard they worked, that it didn't matter, how great their attitude was. There was a whole system of oppression that was going to keep them down. Does that mean that, not a single black person was able to find success? No, of course there were black people, and there are black people, of course, that find success. I think what a large group of black people, especially those that participated in the Great Migration, found was that their expectations were not met when they left the South, right? They didn't find the opportunities that they thought they were going to find. Perhaps it was better than being in the South, but it wasn't necessarily this, groundbreaking change for them. And so it was kind of disappointing. The American dream was disappointing because it didn't matter how hard they worked. They were still behind, okay? And so that is something that is brought up in this play. Some topics or themes. I mentioned the American dream. Well, I think dreams in general are brought up in this play. It is called A Raisin in the Sun, and it's a reference to Langston Hughes's poem, What Happens to a Dream Deferred, right? Harlem, or Dreams Deferred. Anyway, also, family is another topic or a theme, or I guess I should say topic in the novel. It talks a lot about family and how families interact with each other. It is about one particular family. There are a lot of discussions about generational differences. So the older generation versus the younger generation, and how they kind of react to things and think about things in a different way. Prejudice is brought up in this play, especially as it relates to location and homes and where people can live, right? Because that's one form of that systemic racism that exists in the United States, right? Assimilation versus heritage. I'm going to define assimilation in just a second, but essentially we're looking at whether or not we, by the way, when I say we, I'm talking about Black people, so it's kind of weird, but whether or not non-white or people of color should have to assimilate to the dominant culture, or whether they should kind of express and share heritage. And so there's kind of a discussion of that in the play. Oh, look, prejudice is on there again, and so is assimilation heritage. Let's move on to dignity and respect, okay? So how important dignity and respect is to an individual despite prejudice, right? Or in the face of prejudice, to maintain dignity, or to hold on to your own sense of dignity, I should say. Gender roles and power dynamics is another thing brought up in this play. So kind of the role of woman versus the role of man, and expectations of both. And then finally, materialism versus intellectualism. So what's more important to you, right? Money and financial kind of security, or intellectual stimulation, especially as it pertains to finding a mate and someone to spend your life with. Some key terms you should be aware of. One is climax. Okay, that's the major turning point in the play. A climax is not necessarily the most exciting point in a story, although often it is. The climax is a turning point. So the story is heading one direction, and then all of a sudden it turns and goes a different direction. That's the climax. Denouement, it's a French word that means unraveling of the knot. It is the resolution of the plot. So the denouement is when everything kind of comes undone and we now have an ending. Dialogue is the conversation between characters in a play. Okay, so that's between two people. If you have, just one person talking, then that would be a monologue, but a dialogue is between two people. Foil is a character that contrasts with another character on a particular matter or idea. So it's really kind of like opposite characters when it comes to a particular thing. Okay, so when they, fundamentally disagree on one thing, you've got a character foil. Setting, I hope you guys know this by now, but it's the time, place, and mood of a story. The setting of this story, the time period is the 1950s and then the 1960s, probably 1950s though, late 50s. The place, like I said, is Southside Chicago. The mood of the story, I'll let you guys kind of work that out as we read the first act, because that's something I want us to take a look at. Stage directions, those are the instructions written into the script that indicate stage action, so telling the characters or the actors what to do and how to do it. It could be in the movements, or it could be production requirements, like what the set should look like. A theme, and again, I hope you guys know this one by now. A theme is a message or recurring idea within the play. So theme would be like, the message of the story is blah, 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 blah. Okay, a theme is never really one word. It's always a series of words or a statement. Some more words that I want you to know. The first one is deferred, and I think we've already talked about it, but to defer or to be deferred means to be postponed. Wow, 2 T's in put, huh? Okay, so to put off an action or event. Okay, so deferred means it's not going to happen right now. The second word I want you to be familiar with is assimilate or assimilation. It is something that's going to pop up a lot in this play. To assimilate is to start to resemble or to become similar to. So it is to kind of conform. And so this is a debate as to whether or not people with a culture other than the dominant culture should do. If you look at the picture of the Native Americans on the left, you'll see they're in more kind of traditional Native American garb, more kind of what we picture as Native American. But on the right-hand side, you have Native Americans as well that seemed to kind of assimilate to the dominant culture, right? They took off the feather in the hair. They took off the moccasins even. So that would be a form of assimilation. The way that you dress, you could be assimilating to the dominant culture. You can assimilate in the way that you speak. Right? There are a lot of ways to assimilate, but whether or not it's right is something worthy to be discussed, and that's something that is discussed in this play. So I'm excited to share this play with you. Let's get started.